Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls her age. While her classmates spent their weekends shopping or gossiping about boys, she could be found in her grandfather's old garage, tinkering with broken radios and outdated electronics. The musty smell of motor oil and rusty metal had become more familiar to her than expensive perfumes. Her grandfather, a former Navy mechanic, had left behind a collection of tools and equipment that most people would consider junk. Among the scattered items was an ancient telescope that looked like it had seen better days decades ago. The brass fittings were tarnished green, the lens was cloudy with age, and the wooden tripod wobbled whenever someone walked too close to it. Sarah discovered the telescope on a particularly boring summer afternoon when she was 16. Her parents were at work, and she had exhausted all her usual indoor activities. The garage had always been off limits, but curiosity finally got the better of her. She pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into what felt like a museum of forgotten dreams. The telescope sat in the corner, covered by a dusty tarp that made her sneeze when she pulled it away. Most people would have seen it as worthless junk, but Sarah saw potential. She spent the entire afternoon examining every inch of the device, figuring out how the different parts worked together. The mechanics fascinated her, even though she had no idea what she was looking at through the cloudy lens. When her parents came home that evening, they found Sarah completely absorbed in cleaning the old telescope. Her mother shook her head in disappointment, wondering why her daughter couldn't develop more normal interests. Her father simply shrugged, thinking it was just another phase that would pass like all the others. Sarah's interest in the telescope quickly became an obsession. Every free moment was spent in the garage, carefully cleaning each component and researching how to improve its performance. She watched online videos, read library books about optics, and even contacted retired astronomers for advice. Most adults were surprised by her dedication but assumed she would lose interest once school started again. The real challenge came when Sarah decided she wanted to use the telescope for competitive shooting sports. The idea seemed crazy to everyone who heard it, but Sarah had discovered that telescopes and rifle scopes worked on similar principles. If she could modify her grandfather's old telescope correctly, she believed it could outperform expensive modern scopes. Her announcement at the local shooting range was met with polite laughter. The seasoned marksmen, mostly middle-aged men with expensive equipment, couldn't believe that a teenage girl thought she could compete with a piece of antique junk. They had invested thousands of dollars in precision rifles and state-of-the-art scopes. While Sarah showed up with what looked like a science project gone wrong, the range master, Captain Rodriguez, was a retired Marine with 40 years of shooting experience. He had seen plenty of overconfident newcomers come and go, but something about Sarah's quiet determination reminded him of his younger self. While the other shooters joked about her unusual setup, Captain Rodriguez watched carefully as she methodically prepared for her first practice session. Sarah ignored the snickers and whispered comments from the other shooters. She had spent months preparing for this moment, and she wasn't about to let their skepticism shake her confidence. Her modified telescope scope might have looked ridiculous mounted on her rifle, but she knew exactly what it was capable of. The hours she had invested in understanding its mechanics were about to pay off in ways that none of the laughing men could imagine. The first day at the shooting range was harder than Sarah had expected. Setting up her equipment took twice as long as everyone else because her modified telescope scope required careful adjustment before each session. While other shooters simply attached their modern scopes and started firing, Sarah had to manually calibrate multiple components that should have been automated. Captain Rodriguez noticed her struggles but didn't offer help immediately. He wanted to see how she would handle the pressure and whether she had the persistence needed for precision shooting. Many newcomers gave up after their first frustrating session, especially when their equipment didn't perform as expected. The other shooters continued their quiet mockery, placing bets on how quickly the teenager with the antique scope would quit. Marcus Webb, a local police officer with an expensive German scope, was particularly vocal about his doubts. He had won several regional competitions and considered himself an expert on shooting equipment. To him, Sarah's setup was an insult to the serious sport of marksmanship. Sarah's first shots were disappointing by any standard. The bullets scattered across the target in patterns that suggested her scope wasn't properly zeroed. Each miss brought more snickers from the nearby shooters. and Sarah could feel her confidence wavering for the first time since she had started this project. But instead of giving up, Sarah pulled out a small notebook and began recording detailed observations about each shot. She measured wind conditions, noted the temperature, and carefully adjusted her scope between attempts. This systematic approach was unusual for a beginner, and Captain Rodriguez found himself paying closer attention to her methods. After 2 hours of consistent misses, Sarah finally hit the target. It wasn't an impressive shot by competitive standards, but it proved that her modified scope could function. The laughter from other shooters died down slightly as they realized she wasn't going to quit after a few failures. Over the following weeks, Sarah became a regular fixture at the range. She arrived early and stayed late, working methodically to improve her accuracy. Her notebook filled with calculations and observations that most recreational shooters would never bother to record. She treated each session like a science experiment, testing variables and analyzing results. The breakthrough came on a particularly windy afternoon when most other shooters had given up for the day. Sarah noticed that her heavy, stable telescope mount actually performed better in difficult conditions than the lightweight modern scopes that other shooters preferred. While their equipment was affected by vibrations and wind, her grandfather's solid construction remained steady. Captain Rodriguez was the only other person still shooting that day, and he watched with growing interest as Sarah's shots became increasingly accurate. Her notebook system was starting to pay off, and she was learning to compensate for her equipment's quirks in ways that actually gave her advantages over conventional setups. Marcus Webb arrived just as Sarah was finishing her session, and he couldn't hide his surprise when he saw her target. 3 shots were grouped within the center ring, a level of accuracy that many shooters with expensive equipment never achieved. He assumed it was just luck, but Captain Rodriguez had been watching the entire session and knew better. Sarah packed up her equipment without saying anything about her improved performance. She had learned to ignore both the criticism and the praise from other shooters, focusing instead on her own progress. But she couldn't help feeling excited about what she had accomplished with equipment that everyone else considered worthless junk. As she walked to her car, Captain Rodriguez approached her for the first time since her initial visit. He didn't offer congratulations or advice, but simply asked if she was planning to enter any competitions. Sarah hadn't considered it seriously before, but something in his tone suggested that maybe she should. The idea of entering a competition terrified and excited Sarah in equal measure. She had been shooting for only 3 months, while most competitors had years or even decades of experience. Her equipment, despite recent improvements, still looked like something assembled from spare parts compared to the precision instruments used by serious marksmen. Captain Rodriguez suggested she start with a local club match. Nothing too serious or intimidating. These informal competitions were designed for shooters of all skill levels, and they provided a good introduction to the pressure of competitive shooting. Sarah agreed, though she spent the next 2 weeks second-guessing her decision. The night before the competition, Sarah couldn't sleep. She had cleaned and rechecked her equipment multiple times, but doubts kept creeping into her mind. What if her scope malfunctioned under pressure? What if the other competitors laughed her off the range? What if she embarrassed herself so badly that she could never return to the shooting club? Her parents were supportive but clearly worried. They had watched their daughter become increasingly obsessed with shooting, spending every free moment either at the range or researching techniques online. While they admired her dedication, they weren't sure she was ready for the emotional challenge of public failure. The morning of the competition arrived gray and drizzly, with gusty winds that made experienced shooters shake their heads in frustration. Weather conditions like these separated the serious competitors from the casual participants, and several shooters withdrew rather than risk poor scores in difficult circumstances. Sarah arrived at the range 2 hours early, wanting plenty of time to set up and adjust her equipment. The other competitors were already making excuses about the weather, but Sarah saw the conditions as an opportunity to test her heavy, stable scope against lighter modern equipment that might be more affected by wind. Marcus Webb was among the registered competitors, and he made no effort to hide his amusement when he saw Sarah's name on the entry list. He had brought his most expensive rifle for the competition, confident that the weather would eliminate most of the amateur shooters before they could post embarrassing scores. The competition format was straightforward. Each shooter would fire 10 shots at targets placed at increasing distances, starting at 100 yards and ending at 600 yards. Points were awarded based on accuracy, with bonus points for shots that hit the center ring. Most experienced shooters expected the weather to make precision shooting nearly impossible. Sarah drew a middle position in the shooting order, which gave her time to observe other competitors and adjust her strategy accordingly. She watched carefully as the first shooters struggled with wind gusts that pushed their bullets off target. Even experienced marksmen were having difficulty maintaining accuracy in the challenging conditions. When her turn came, Sarah approached the firing line with outward calm that surprised everyone who knew how nervous she had been. Her hands were steady as she set up her equipment, and she took extra time to study the wind patterns before loading her rifle. Her first shot hit the outer ring of the target, a respectable result given the conditions but nothing spectacular. The second shot moved closer to center, and by the third shot, it was clear that Sarah was compensating for the weather better than most competitors had managed. Captain Rodriguez watched from the observation area, noting how Sarah's systematic approach was serving her well under pressure. While other shooters were getting frustrated by missed shots and allowing emotions to affect their performance, Sarah remained focused on the technical aspects of each attempt. By the halfway point of her string, Sarah had posted a score that put her in the top third of all competitors. This was far better than anyone had expected from a teenager with homemade equipment, and the casual conversations among spectators shifted from amusement to genuine interest. Marcus Webb was scheduled to shoot immediately after Sarah, and he watched her final shots with growing concern. If she could shoot that well with antique equipment, what did that say about his expensive gear and years of experience? For the first time, he began to worry that his assumptions about equipment superiority might be wrong. Marcus Webb's performance that day was the worst of his competitive career. The pressure of following Sarah's unexpected success combined with increasingly difficult wind conditions caused him to second-guess every shot. His expensive equipment, which had always been a source of confidence, suddenly felt inadequate compared to the teenager's steady performance with her grandfather's telescope. Sarah finished the first round in 5th place overall, a result that stunned everyone except Captain Rodriguez. He had been watching her systematic approach for months and recognized that her success wasn't based on luck or beginner's fortune. She had developed genuine skill through careful observation and methodical practice. The other competitors began paying attention to Sarah's equipment for the first time, examining her modified telescope scope with curiosity instead of mockery. Several experienced shooters asked technical questions about how she had adapted the optics for rifle use, and Sarah found herself explaining modifications she had researched and implemented on her own. Word about the teenager with the antique scope spread quickly through the regional shooting community. Within a week, Sarah received invitations to 3 different competitions, including a state-level match that typically attracted only the most serious marksmen. The attention was flattering but also intimidating, as Sarah realized that expectations were now much higher. Captain Rodriguez approached Sarah after the club match with an unexpected proposal. He offered to provide additional coaching and help her prepare for more serious competitions, but only if she was willing to commit to intensive training. The casual weekend shooting sessions would need to become a serious athletic pursuit. Sarah's parents were divided about this opportunity. Her mother worried that competitive shooting would consume too much time and energy, potentially affecting her academic performance. Her father was more supportive, recognizing that his daughter had discovered something she was genuinely passionate about and talented at pursuing. The decision became easier when Sarah learned about an upcoming regional championship that would attract competitors from 5 states. The winner would receive a significant scholarship and an invitation to the National Junior Shooting Championships. For the first time, Sarah saw a path that could lead from her grandfather's garage to genuine recognition. Training with Captain Rodriguez was more demanding than Sarah had anticipated. He pushed her to maintain accuracy under various stress conditions, including time pressure, physical fatigue, and deliberate distractions. Her notebook system evolved into a comprehensive database of shooting conditions and performance variables. The most challenging aspect of training wasn't technical, but mental. Captain Rodriguez insisted that Sarah learn to manage the psychological pressure that came with increased expectations. The casual observers at local matches were replaced by serious competitors and knowledgeable judges who would notice every mistake. Sarah's equipment underwent continuous refinement during this period. She learned to make micro-adjustments that improved accuracy by fractions of an inch, improvements that were invisible to casual observers, but crucial for competitive success. Her grandfather's telescope was becoming something entirely new while retaining its original character. The first test of her improved preparation came at a district match that attracted over 60 competitors. Sarah's modified scope still drew curious looks, but the comments were now respectful rather than dismissive. Her reputation had preceded her, and other shooters were genuinely interested in her unconventional approach. This competition introduced Sarah to a different level of pressure. Media representatives were present to document the event, and several sponsors were scouting for potential athletes to support. A strong performance could open doors that Sarah had never imagined, while a poor showing might end her competitive career before it truly began. The stakes were higher than anything Sarah had experienced, but her training with Captain Rodriguez had prepared her for exactly this situation. As she approached the firing line for her first string of shots, she felt nervous but confident. The months of systematic preparation were about to face their ultimate test. Marcus Webb was also competing that day, having spent considerable money upgrading his equipment after his embarrassing performance at the club match. He avoided eye contact with Sarah, still embarrassed by his previous failure. But he was determined to prove that experience and expensive gear could overcome whatever advantage her unusual approach might provide. The district match began under perfect shooting conditions, with minimal wind and excellent visibility. Sarah had mixed feelings about the ideal weather, as her heavy telescope scope had proven most advantageous in difficult conditions where lighter equipment struggled. Perfect conditions would level the playing field and test her pure marksmanship skills. Sarah drew an early shooting position, which meant less time to observe other competitors but also less opportunity for nerves to build. As she set up her equipment, photographers captured images of her unusual scope configuration, and she overheard several spectators placing bets on whether the teenager with homemade equipment could compete against seasoned marksman, Captain Rodriguez. Positioned himself where Sarah could see him during her shooting string, providing silent encouragement and technical reminders through predetermined hand signals. His presence helped calm her nerves, but ultimately she would have to rely on months of preparation and systematic practice. Her first shot was slightly off-center, a result that would have been excellent for most shooters but felt disappointing to Sarah given the perfect conditions. She made a minor adjustment to her scope and prepared for the second shot, forcing herself to ignore the whispered comments from nearby spectators. The second shot hit the center ring perfectly, and Sarah felt her confidence returning. The systematic approach that Captain Rodriguez had drilled into her training was working exactly as intended. She recorded the wind conditions and lighting in her notebook before preparing for the third shot. By the end of her first 10-shot string, Sarah had posted a score that put her in second place among all competitors. The result shocked most observers who had expected her to perform well, but not to challenge the leading marksman. Marcus Webb, shooting in the same relay, managed only a middle-ranking performance despite his expensive equipment upgrades. The competition format required 3 separate strings of 10 shots each, with different targets and distances for each round. Sarah's consistency across all conditions would be tested, as would her ability to maintain concentration during the extended competition. Many talented shooters had seen their hopes destroyed by a single poor string. During the break between strings, several experienced competitors approached Sarah to examine her equipment more closely. Word had spread that she had modified an antique telescope into a precision shooting scope, and veteran marksmen were curious about the technical details of her approach. Sarah answered their questions politely, but remained focused on her preparation for the next string. She reviewed her notebook entries from the first round, identifying patterns and making minor adjustments to her scope settings. This systematic approach impressed the observing competitors, many of whom relied more on intuition than detailed analysis. The second string took place at longer distances, where equipment differences became more pronounced. Sarah's heavy, stable scope mounting system provided advantages that became obvious as shooting distances increased. While other competitors struggled with small movements that were magnified over longer ranges, Sarah's setup remained rock-steady. Her second string performance was even better than the first, moving her into the overall lead by a narrow margin. The result sent whispers of excitement through the spectator area, as local media representatives realized they might be witnessing an upset victory by an unknown teenager with antique equipment. Captain Rodriguez allowed himself a small smile as he watched Sarah maintain her composure under increasing pressure. The mental training he had provided was proving as valuable as the technical instruction, and Sarah was handling the attention and expectations with remarkable maturity. The final string would determine the competition winner, and Sarah found herself grouped with the most experienced shooters for the final round. These were marksmen who had competed at national levels, and they would not be intimidated by a teenager's early success. The pressure was about to increase dramatically. As Sarah prepared for the decisive third string, she noticed that her hands were completely steady, despite the enormous stakes involved. Months of systematic training had prepared her for exactly this moment, and she felt ready to prove that dedication and intelligence could overcome expensive equipment and years of experience. Marcus Webb watched from the sidelines, having been eliminated from contention by his poor second-string performance. His expensive gear had failed to deliver the results he had expected, while Sarah's homemade scope continued to perform flawlessly under pressure. The final string began with Sarah holding a 3-point lead over the nearest competitor, a margin that could disappear with a single poor shot. The pressure was unlike anything she had experienced, with dozens of spectators watching her every movement and photographers documenting each moment for local newspapers. Her main competition came from David Chen, a college student who had been shooting competitively for 8 years and held several state records. He used equipment that cost more than most people spent on their cars, and he had never been seriously challenged by someone with Sarah's limited experience and unconventional gear. Sarah's first shot in the final string hit the center ring perfectly, maintaining her lead and demonstrating that pressure wasn't affecting her accuracy. The crowd grew quieter as spectators realized they were witnessing something special. Even experienced competitors stopped their own preparations to watch the teenager with the antique scope. David Chen responded with his own perfect shot, keeping the competition close and ensuring that every remaining shot would be crucial. The parallel between his state-of-the-art equipment and Sarah's modified telescope created a compelling narrative that had photographers working overtime to capture dramatic images. By the midpoint of the final string, both Sarah and David had maintained perfect accuracy, with neither shooter gaining a decisive advantage. The competition had essentially become a two-person duel, with other marksmen falling too far behind to have realistic chances of victory. Captain Rodriguez remained outwardly calm, but internally he was amazed by Sarah's performance under extreme pressure. Her systematic training had prepared her well, but competing at this level required natural talent that couldn't be taught. Sarah was demonstrating abilities that suggested she could succeed at much higher levels of competition. The 8th shot of the string proved to be the turning point. David Chen, perhaps feeling the pressure of being challenged by a teenager, rushed his preparation slightly and produced his first shot outside the center ring. It was still an excellent result by most standards, but it gave Sarah a significant advantage heading into the final 2 shots. Sarah forced herself to maintain her normal routine despite the growing excitement from spectators. She recorded wind conditions in her notebook, made a minor scope adjustment, and prepared for her 9th shot with the same methodical approach she had used throughout the competition. The shot hit dead center, extending her lead. David Chen's 9th shot was excellent but not perfect, leaving him needing a miracle on his final attempt to overcome Sarah's lead. The pressure had clearly affected his performance, while Sarah seemed to be getting steadier as the stakes increased. The crowd sensed that an upset victory was becoming increasingly likely. As Sarah prepared for her final shot, the range fell completely silent. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something historically significant. If she could maintain her accuracy for one more shot, a teenager with homemade equipment would defeat some of the region's most experienced marksmen. Sarah's final shot was the best of her entire string, hitting the exact center of the target with mechanical precision. The crowd erupted in applause, and even competing marksmen acknowledged the remarkable achievement. She had won the district championship by the largest margin in the competition's 15-year history. Captain Rodriguez allowed himself to show emotion for the first time all day, walking onto the range to congratulate Sarah on a performance that exceeded his highest expectations. Her systematic approach and modified telescope scope had proven capable of defeating conventional wisdom about shooting sports. David Chen graciously congratulated Sarah on her victory, admitting that her unconventional equipment had advantages he had never considered. Other competitors gathered around to examine her modified telescope scope more closely, finally understanding that innovation and intelligence had trumped expensive conventional equipment. Local media representatives rushed to interview Sarah about her victory, but she remained focused on the technical aspects of her performance, rather than the emotional impact of her success. Her notebook contained detailed records of every shot, and she was already analyzing the data to identify areas for continued improvement. The victory qualified Sarah for the state championship, where she would face even more experienced competitors and potentially earn national recognition. But more importantly, she had proven to herself and others that dedication and systematic preparation could overcome seemingly insurmountable advantages in equipment and experience. The state championship took place 3 months later at a facility that typically hosted national-level competitions. Sarah arrived to find herself competing against marksmen who had been featured in shooting magazines and whose equipment sponsors had provided them with prototypes of gear that wouldn't be available to the public for years. The media attention had grown significantly since her district victory. Several national shooting publications had published articles about the teenager who had modified her grandfather's telescope into a precision scope, and equipment manufacturers were curious about her unconventional approach to marksmanship. Sarah's parents made the trip to watch her compete at the state level, finally understanding that their daughter's garage hobby had evolved into something with genuine significance. Her mother had initially worried about the time Sarah spent practicing, but seeing her compete against accomplished adults had changed her perspective completely. Captain Rodriguez felt more nervous than Sarah as the competition began. He had coached talented shooters before, but none had faced this level of scrutiny while using such unconventional equipment. The pressure on Sarah was enormous, and he wondered if systematic preparation could overcome the intimidation factor of competing at this elevated level. The competition format was more demanding than anything Sarah had experienced, with multiple shooting positions, varying distances, and time limits that tested both accuracy and speed. Her heavy telescope scope, which had been advantageous in previous competitions, now seemed cumbersome compared to the lightweight modern optics used by other competitors. Sarah's first string was solid, but not spectacular, leaving her in 4th place among the 24 competitors. The result was respectable given the competition level, but Sarah knew she would need to improve significantly to have any chance of victory. Her systematic approach would be tested under the most demanding conditions she had ever faced. During the break between strings, Sarah noticed that several competitors were struggling with equipment malfunctions. Their sophisticated modern scopes, while lighter and theoretically more precise, were proving vulnerable to the stress of extended competition. Her grandfather's sturdy telescope, meanwhile, continued to function flawlessly. The second string took place in deteriorating weather conditions, with increasing wind and light rain that challenged every competitor's ability to maintain accuracy. This was exactly the situation where Sarah's heavy, stable equipment provided maximum advantage over lighter modern alternatives. Sarah's second string performance moved her into 2nd place overall, just 3 points behind the leader. The improvement in difficult conditions surprised no one who had watched her previous competitions, but it demonstrated that her success wasn't limited to perfect shooting weather. The final string would determine not just the state champion, but also qualification for the national championship. Sarah found herself competing directly against Jennifer Walsh, a college shooting coach with 15 years of competitive experience and equipment that represented the latest advances in optical technology. As the final string began, Sarah felt completely calm for the first time in the entire competition. The pressure that had seemed overwhelming earlier was now just background noise, and she was able to focus entirely on the technical aspects of each shot. Her months of mental training with Captain Rodriguez were paying dividends. Her first shot of the final string hit the center ring perfectly, and Sarah knew immediately that she was shooting at her absolute peak performance level. The systematic preparation, modified equipment, and mental training had combined to create a moment of perfect execution under maximum pressure. Jennifer Walsh responded with her own perfect shot, ensuring that the final string would be decided by the narrowest possible margins. Both competitors were shooting at levels that would have been impressive at national competitions. and spectators were witnessing marksmanship excellence regardless of who ultimately won. Shot after shot, both Sarah and Jennifer maintained perfect accuracy, with neither gaining a decisive advantage. The competition had become a test of mental endurance as much as shooting skill, and the crowd watched in respectful silence as two marksmen pushed each other to extraordinary performance levels. The final shot belonged to Sarah, who needed to match Jennifer's accuracy to force a playoff or exceed it to win outright. As she prepared for the most important shot of her life, Sarah thought briefly about her grandfather's telescope and how far she had traveled from that dusty garage where her journey had begun. Her final shot was perfect, hitting the exact center of the target and securing victory by a single point. The crowd erupted in appreciation for both competitors, recognizing that they had witnessed something special regardless of their equipment preferences or preconceptions about conventional shooting sports. Captain Rodriguez later called it the finest display of marksmanship he had observed. In 4 decades of involvement with shooting sports, Sarah's victory proved that intelligence, dedication, and systematic preparation could triumph over expensive equipment and extensive experience when combined with genuine talent and mental toughness.